Pain inflicted during the execution process, too much or just right.
The history of the death penalty in America. Capital punishment is another expression for the death penalty, the legal execution of a criminal. The word capital comes from the Latin word for head. In ancient times, capital punishment was often carried out by beheading. This method has never been used in America, but criminals have been put to death by shooting, hanging, electrocution, poison gas, and lethal injection. Today, all of the states with the death penalty use lethal injection. Some states, however, allow one of these other methods as an option. In the American colonies, legal execution took place as early as 1630. As in England, the death penalty was imposed for many crimes, even minor ones such as picking pockets or stealing a loaf of bread. During the 1800s in England, for example, 270 crimes were capital offenses or crimes punishable by death. Thousands of people sometimes attended public hangings. Gradually, however, England and America reduced the number of capital offenses until the main focus was on first-degree murder, murder showing deliberation, willfulness, and premeditation. They also moved execution within the wall of prisons to eliminate the spectacle of public executions. Different types of execution. The primary means of execution in the United States have been hanging, electrocution, the gas chamber, firing squad, and lethal injection. The Supreme Court has never found the method of execution to be unconstitutional, though some methods have been declared unconstitutional by state courts. The predominance of lethal injection as a preferred means of execution in all states in the modern era may have put off any judgment by the court regarding old methods. Because of a resistance by drug manufacturers to provide the drugs typically used in lethal injections, some states now allow the use of alternative methods if lethal injection cannot be performed. Controversies surrounding the method to be used have been delayed execution in many states, contributing to an overall decline in the use of the death penalty.
To the 1890s, hanging was a primary method of execution used in the United States. Hanging is still used in Delaware and Washington, although both have lethal injections as an alternative method of execution. For execution by this method, the inmate must be weighed the day before the execution, and a rehearsal is done using a sandbag of the same weight as the prisoner. This is to determine the length of the job necessary to ensure a quick death. If the rope is too long, the inmate could be decapitated, and if it's too short, the strangulation could take as long as 45 minutes. The rope should be 3/4 of an inch to 1 1/4 inch in diameter, must be boiled and stretched to eliminate spring or coiling. The knot should be lubricated with wax and soap to ensure a smooth sliding action, according to the 1969 U.S. Manual.
Electrocution. Seeking a more humane method of execution than hanging, New York built the first electric chair in 1888 and executed William Kemmler in 1890. Soon other states adopted the execution method. Today, electrocution is not used as the sole method of execution in any state. Electrocution was the sole method in Nebraska until the state Supreme Court ruled the method unconstitutional in February 2008. For execution by the electric chair, the person is usually shaved and strapped to the chair with belts across the chest, groin, legs, and arms. A metal skullcap-shaped electrode is attached to the scalp and forehead over a sponge moistened with saline. The sponge must not be too wet or the saline short-circuits the electric current, and not too dry as it would have very high resistance. An additional electrode is moistened with conductive jelly and attached to the portion of the prisoner's legs that have been shaved to reduce resistance to electricity. The prisoner is then blindfolded. After the execution team has withdrawn to the observation room, the warden signals the executioner, who pulls the handle to connect the power supply. A jolt of between 500 and 2000 volts, which lasts for about 30 seconds, is given. The current surges and is then turned off, at which the body is seen to relax. The doctor waits a few seconds for the body to cool down, then check to see if the inmate's heart is still beating. If it is, another jolt is applied. This process continues until the prisoner is dead. The prisoner's hands often grip the chair, and there may be violent movements of the limbs which can result in dislocation or fractures. The tissues swell, defecation occurs, steam and smoke rises, and there is a small smell of burning. A U.S. Supreme Court Justice, William Brennan, once offered the following description of an execution by electric chair. The prisoner's eyeballs sometimes pop out and rest on his cheeks. The prisoner often defecates, urinates, and vomits blood and drool. The body turns bright red as the temperature rises, and prisoner's flesh swells and his skin stretches to the point of breaking. Sometimes the prisoner catches fire. Witness hear loud and sustained sound like bacon frying, and the silky sweet smell of burning flesh permeates the chamber.
Today, 5 states authorize lethal gas as a method of execution, but all have lethal injections as an alternative method. A federal court in California found this method to be cruel and unusual punishment. For execution by this method, the condemned person is strapped to a chair in an airtight chamber. Below the chair rests a pail of sulfuric acid. A long scope is typically affixed to the inmate's chair so that the doctor outside the chamber can pronounce death. Once everyone has left the chamber, the room is sealed. The warden then gives a signal to the executioner, who flicks a lever that releases crystal of gas in the pail. This causes a chemical reaction that releases hydrogen gas. The prisoner is instructed to breathe deeply to speed up the process. Most prisoners, however, try to hold their breath, and some struggle. The inmate does not lose consciousness immediately. According to a former warden, at first there's evidence of extreme horror, pain, and strangling. The eyes pop, the skin turns purple, and the victim begins to drool.
Firing squad. On March 23, 2015, the firing squad was reauthorized in Utah as a viable method of execution if and only if the state was unable to obtain the drugs necessary to carry out a lethal injection execution. Prior to this reauthorization, firing squad was only a method of execution in Utah if chosen by an inmate before lethal injection became the sole means of execution. The most recent execution by this method was that of Ronnie Gardner. By his own choosing, Gardner was executed by firing squad in Utah on June 17, 2010. For execution by this method, the inmate is typically bound to a chair with leather straps across the waist and head in front of an oval-shaped canvas wall. The chair is surrounded by sandbags to observe the inmate's blood. The black hood is pulled over the inmate's head. A doctor locates the inmate's heart with a stethoscope and pins a circular white cloth target over it. Standing in an enclosure 20 feet away, 5 shooters are armed with a .30 caliber rifle loaded with single rounds. One of the shooters was given blank rounds. Each of the shooters aims this rifle through a slot in the canvas and fires at the inmate. The prisoner dies as a result of blood loss caused by a rupture of the heart or a large blood vessel, or tearing of their lungs. The person shot loses consciousness when shock causes a fall in the supply of blood to the brain. If the shooters miss the heart by accident or intention, the person bleeds to death slowly. Lethal injection. In 1977, Oklahoma became the first state to adopt lethal injection as a means of execution, though it would be 5 more years until Charles Brooke would become the first person executed by lethal injection in Texas on December 22nd, 1982. Today, all of 32 states have the death penalty using this method. When this method is used, the condemned person, usually bound to a gurney, and a member of the execution team positions several heart monitors on his skin. 2 needles, one is back up, are those inserted into usable veins, usually in the inmate's arms. Long tubes connects the needle through a hole in a cement block wall to several intravenous strips. The first is a harmless saline solution that is started immediately. Then a warden signals and a curtain is raised, exposing the inmate to witness in an adjoining room. Then the inmate is injected with sodium thiopentin, an anesthetic, which puts the inmate to sleep. Next flows povidone or panicronium bromide, which paralyzes the entire muscle system and stops the inmate's breathing. Finally, the flow of the potassium chloride stops the heart. Death results from the anesthetic overdose and respiratory and cardiac arrest while the condemned person is unconscious. Method ethics preclude doctors from participation in execution. However, doctor will certify the inmate is dead. This lack of medical participation can be problematic because often injections are performed by inexperienced technicians or orderlies. If a member of the execution team injects a drug into a muscle instead of the vein, or if the needle becomes clogged, extreme pain can result. Many prisoners have damaged veins resulting from intravenous drug use, and it is sometimes difficult to find a usable vein, resulting in long delays with the inmate remains strapped to the gurney. Is lethal execution the right way to serve justice? The death penalty in the United States is applied in an unfair and unjust manner against people largely dependent on how much money they have, the skill of the attorneys, race of the victim, and where the crime took place. People of color are far more likely to be executed than white people, especially if the victim is white. The death penalty is a waste of taxpayers' funds and has no public safety benefit. The vast majority of law enforcement professionals surveyed agree that capital punishment does not deter violent crime. A survey of police chiefs nationwide found they ranked the death penalty lowest amongst ways to reduce violent crime. They ranked increasing the number of police officers, reducing drug abuse, and creating a better economy with more jobs higher than the death penalty as the best way to reduce violence. The FBI has found the states with the death penalty have the highest murder rates. Innocent people are too often sentenced to death. Since 1973, over 156 people have been released from death rows in 26 states because of innocence. Nationally, at least one person is exonerated for every 10 that are executed.